The scene I'll be analyzing comes from Alejandro Inarritu's Babel. It introduces two of the pivotal characters in the film, Richard and Susan Jones, and the marital crisis the two are dealing with after the death of their infant son. The first couple establishing shots function to contextualize the action. We see pieces of the Moroccan landscape and civilization, and the outdoor cafe setup where the action takes place. This low plane medium shot is the first we get of either of these two characters. A couple things become immediately apparent about the shot's composition here. First, there's an obvious divide between the two, who occupy opposite ends of the frame, with the large standing figure in the center foreground serving to highlight their separation. Two, there's also a stark contrast in the color of their dress. Richard on the right is wearing gray, his features are dark, and his face is covered in a scraggly beard. This makes him seem haggard or tired, not necessarily lazy or dirty, but dark, almost brooding. Susan on the left is wearing white and looks clean and austere, nearly rigid. There's also more light, open space behind Susan, whereas the far background behind Richard is shadowy and there are dark-colored fringes hanging from the shelter that's just out of frame. This close of Richard both gets a clear look at his rugged, tired face and also begins to establish a sense of constancy in his character through the camera's determination to keep him in frame despite the intrusion of the waiter on the right. This is also the first time in the scene that the use of a handheld camera becomes startlingly apparent. This style is harnessed in every shot throughout the rest of the scene to indicate confusion and disillusionment in their relationship. There's a sense of uneasiness between the two as they attempt to reconcile their relationship, and the hairy shaking of the camera reflects that throughout the conversation. Richard orders quickly, assured of his decision, but as the camera rapidly pans to Susan, we feel a bit disoriented. Then we get a very quick cut that breaks one of the cardinal rules of spatial cinematography. In a scene of dialogue, the first objective of the director is to establish a locational understanding with the audience through opposite framing of the two characters in conversation. In other words, to know where we, the eye of the camera, sit in the scene, we will see Richard in the right frame and Susan in the left frame every time. Here, though, breaking this rule achieves once again a great sense of disorientation. The camera reverses its position and Susan is suddenly in the right frame. We feel her confusion and distress as this quickly happens. The camera then tilts down to begin what will become a motif of close-up hand shots that represent both Susan's stress and her inability to focus on her husband as they converse. This objective shot of the waiter, in my maybe somewhat pretentious opinion, is a mistake. It pulls us away from the drama between the two. I also don't feel that it helps further establish a sense of distraction in Susan as the hand shots do, since the point of the hand shots is to convey that she is occupied with herself and the way she feels instead of her husband's apologetic demeanor. But when we cut back to Susan, we see her resigned to ordering a plate of eggplant while, settling in, Richard asks for 2 Cokes and looks down. This next shot I'm going to interpret as a subjective shot, but it's a bit unclear. It's another hand shot. Susan is once again distracted for the moment and is preoccupied with herself and her feelings. We then get a tilt back up to her face. The depth of field becomes more compressed, and we get the first true close-up of Susan, and we see in her expression what may be the cause of her distraction. She seems wounded, casting a mistrustful look across the table at Richard. The fact that her face is the only element in the shot becomes important when we get another subjective shot from Susan's perspective. While we see that Susan fills the frame when we get a POV shot from Richard, signifying that he is intent on her, Susan's POV shot looking at Richard still has a fair portion of her upper body in the frame. This suggests that she is reserved, that while he's reaching out to her, she still feels resentment towards him. The dynamic continues throughout the larger part of the scene. The shot lengths are unnaturally long for a dialogue sequence, especially since there's very little actual dialogue. This makes the whole scene seem forlorn, weary, and depressed, reflecting the relational drudgery between the two. Also at this point, it's important to note that while the subjective shots of Susan have no other objects or movement in the background, the subjective shots of Richard have constant movement in 2 major areas, which, when combined with dark colors and his demeanor, make his character feel more chaotic and distressed. This next subjective shot breaks the reverse angle pattern of flipping back and forth between these two characters, and instead focuses on a few older couples at a table across the cafe. Susan is distracted by their happiness, by her inability to relate to her husband, or by her feeling that she will never grow old, never be happy with him. She seems visibly dismayed at this sight. The waiter then crowds the frame, making her feel constricted, alone, and squeezed into a small space. We see her then begin to focus on hands and objects again instead of Richard. He wants ice in his Coke, but she forces him to throw it out because the water may contain parasites. We get a lot of cuts and editing activity that breaks up the slower pace of the earlier shots. Susan is completely preoccupied with the practical activity of the table. This nervous mixture of close-ups and inserts helps to suggest that she is only dealing with Richard as an issue or a problem, not a person. She becomes frustrated, throwing the ice into the dust, which becomes some of the only sound we get in the scene other than the human voice. This might suggest that while Richard is seemingly willing to risk the potential problems of preserving their relationship, Susan is too hurt and is, in her pain, considering throwing away their marriage. She becomes nervous and distracted again by the activity of her hands, reorganizing her silverware to quickly maintain control of her space. The earlier dynamic of Susan's full-frame face, contrasted with the objective shots of Richard being somewhat covered by Susan in the foreground, returns here. Susan tries to draw back in defense, picking a fight with Richard, while Richard remains emotionally open, refusing to start an argument. We then get another tilt to the final hand shot. Going back, we see that while Richard has remained intent on Susan, giving her the full frame of his subjective shots, Susan has been distracted numerous times throughout the sequence. This pattern gives the viewer a very effective picture of the relationship between the two. Susan, hurt and betrayed, is drawing away from Richard, closing herself off from him, while Richard, in a position of calm submission, seeks reconciliation between the two. All of this has been conveyed not with dialogue, but through the use of framing, composition, including color and movement, sound, and the repetitious juxtaposition of subjective shots.